Just because this, all of you have had at least a Q&A session as a single speaker, I want to start with Shay, and then we will open it up after that. But so first, direct any questions towards Shay.
Start, congratulate Shay. An exceptionally good presentation, very courageous. In this country, we had a conversation, we're having conversations about trying to come to grips with the world of linguists. Like you, I try to sit in both camps, but how to begin to have this conversation versus what they think we hear versus what they hear.
Yeah.
I noticed you said that earlier.
Yeah.
How do we begin to start to do this, considering the power of the university at large, particularly those that drive the Australian Linguistic Society? I'm going to throw it straight out there.
Yeah. Well, I think to speak to what you first said about the writing, there was a linguist at the University of Arizona who gave a talk at a conference, and she spoke about the different orthographies that had been developed for Tono Odom, and how when she teaches those orthographies, she tells her classes that these are not evolutions but transition periods in orthography, where other people have come in and heard the language and kind of imposed what they think about it. And I think a lot of it really comes down to, I was reflecting over lunch a lot about what, and Andrew, Ross and I were talking about this as well, the difference between quote unquote like decolonization versus creolization, which I had never thought about that in that way before. And like for myself, right, like I can think of myself as, you know, an Indigenous Irish person, but I also grew up as an American in a colonial world. I was educated in a colonial world, like that's what I know. And so decolonizing feels kind of inappropriate, or like it doesn't apply, whereas I can, you know, add little bits of Indigenous worldview and perspective to myself that change how I, you know, act and interact with people. And so I think that it really just comes down to finding researchers and people who are willing to do that, right? Who are willing to have an open mind. And, you know, if you encounter a linguist who just wants to sit with you and take from you, that's not somebody that you should work with or that you should want to work with, right? You'd want to work with somebody who wants to learn from you, who wants to, you know, be a part of it. And I think that there are people that are like that out there, but they need, you know, more introductions to Indigenous thought and stuff like that. So
I'm going to add something that I think has relevance. One of the differences that has made, well, one of the things that has made a difference with Shay is the exposure that she's had to an individual who has a worldview that is very much different from an Anglo-centric worldview, who has language. And when I listen to the things that Shay is doing, I sometimes say, yeah, I taught her well. But I also have said, and she'll tell you this, that Shay, stop telling people I mentor you at the university, because as soon as she tells them that, the landscape shifts for her. And it's been a struggle for her. And I've said, stop telling them that I've mentored you. But the important thing is having, people talk about culture, people talk about language and culture, and they do it all the time, and often they don't have language when they talk about language and culture. And one of the differences is your worldview and how you approach that. Being bilingual I can step in and out of both worlds smoothly and cross over, use what I know from one world to address people in another world, and that's very important. And that's one of the things that comes with being grounded in your language and culture. Right. So it's open. Any questions? Anyone?
I guess I was wondering that building off of that, where do you see those avenues, those avenues as defined, or influence those photographies that already exist and sculpture?
Yeah. I think a big part of it is just getting community members to do it themselves so that there's not an outside sort of perspective that's imposed. I think that's really crucial. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
I guess that if community members do it themselves, there's that crack that it then is seen as the source. Okay? If orthographies already exist, but these are multiple sources, where is there in to have theirs valued because it's theirs.
Well, yeah, I don't really know about it.
Do you want help?
Anyone else?
Yeah, I thought I could kind of speak to that a little bit. I'll try to project. I'm talking kind of quiet, but as a community member who's working on my language, I don't have a linguistics background. I mean, I guess now I do, but as of 2 years ago, I didn't. And my ability to go into higher education, pursue a PhD, I started as a master's student, and then go on to a PhD, is not something that is available to everyone. It's obviously something that takes a significant amount of time and commitment and financial commitment, and you can't expect everyone to just be able to quit their job with a PhD. And so I think the important thing is to kind of realize that linguistics, academia, universities, they don't own this kind of technology of documenting our languages. Like, we're using linguistics as a tool. That's how I think about it. It's like I can speak all this jargon about complex verbal morphophonology and but I have to remind myself that it only has a function as a descriptive tool, and that's how we're using it. And just because another scholar of a language doesn't have that formal training, they're not using these buzzwords, doesn't mean that it's not legitimate, that it's not linguistics. Community members are doing linguistics all the time. And I think of our first dictionary of Chickasaw was written in the 1970s, and it was this old couple, Minnie Mae and Jesse Humes, who just literally sat down at their kitchen table with a typewriter and just typed out every word that they could think of. And that is linguistics. Maybe the linguists at Harvard or something don't think of it as linguistics, but it is. So I think the core, and I'll wrap up, I just think the core thing of breaking down this idea of you have to go get a PhD, you have to put everything in these hyper academic terms to be taken seriously. I think we need to deconstruct that notion, because there's plenty of indigenous linguists, they just aren't recognized as such by academia.
There's an important message. When Margaret Mead, who was the first female anthropologist, started doing her research, criticism that she received was she did it like a man, because she was trained in a male field by male academics. And so that is something that has to constantly be at one's forefront. The fact that Andrew came to linguistics late shows a difference in how he approaches the discipline. But if you sort of grow up in the discipline, if you have that old mentality, even if you are native, you come out with that mentality and you go about the field the same way that any non-native would go about it.
And I've had to be very careful, being mindful that I don't get sucked into it, because I find academic stuff interesting, but interesting isn't necessarily useful. And I have to remind myself, why am I doing this? Yeah, that's a very
We have a lot of people on the table.
Jackie, it's a really great presentation, but I think a lot of the issues are nuanced. I think there's, I mean, look, I don't have the answers. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. I feel like this idea that the population is to grow in this world, so the functioning society is a big part of the problem. So, hopefully, for example, by 2040, across council wants our population to go up by 40,000 or something. And I just wonder how that's sustainable. How is it sustainable for water? They still can't even take care of our rubbish, truck it up to Tamworth. I don't, and so it's a global thing, this idea of population growth, because it's all about money. So I'm not asking the question yet.
No. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a wicked problem, because, growth is good, and then the population is just out of control, really. And then there's the social aspects of Australia should house more people, and, we'll start getting environmental refugees from South Pacific already. But water is our limiting factor. Like water, and we know that. I think there's been enough research to say, 25 will have gone past that. So until we go to our next dry time,
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't that long ago.
it wasn't that long ago. And I guess that's one of the things we're looking at on the photo. We've only got 2,000 people. Haven't got enough housing already. And this would be fly out workers, like on a landslide. Try and add it up, and just our council has such a small rate space, they can't afford to keep our roads, just basic local roads. So if you just go through all of them, how can this be? I feel like it's impossible, but it's on the agenda, and it might happen. So it is. It's. I guess what I wanted to try and share is that, we expect a lot for rural people to look after the country with very little funds. So farmers, for example, in Australia or one of the New Zealand is also the lowest of all the OECD countries of how much government gives over to support agriculture. My PhD was about the whole land care NRM, where's all the money gone, how much is getting onto country, and it was tiny compared to, we built another bureaucracy somehow with the best of intentions, and now there's even less money going on to country to rehabilitate or, and so how do we, but we're a wealthy country, and how do we find ways to share the costs, I think. And if you look at the world population and where it's sitting, I keep looking at it, we've got 8 billion people, only 70% live in urban. That means we're relying on 30% of the world to feed 100% of the world.
So I suppose it's the nuance I talk about.
Yeah.
We talk about farming, and we know the damage of cattle and sheep and introduced species
Yeah.
on the country. But now farmers are considered to be land managers. So for me, that's problematic in my mind. And then I also see problems in the green movement. Where a lot of these green movements And then this idea of the Great Climate National Park, how do we make it stronger so that we can find money in a stronger place?
Well, I guess all those values are there and sort of recognised, like the Great Climate Park is going to be preserved. And we've got the World Heritage Area, and we've already got government saying strategic agricultural land. And I do spend a lot of time with farmers, and there's a lot of environmental value and good environmental work on a lot of farms that we would expect. But the thing is, there is, I think it's, I can't remember, the percentage is really high. How much of our native vegetation is actually on agricultural land? That includes native grasses. A lot of the organically certified cattle are just in all that native grass country, you know. But I guess, you know, there are problems with agriculture, and we do need to fix those because they're contributing to all of our environmental problems. But at the same time, we have to be self-sufficient in food. You know, there's a lot of cattle that what happens, say, if we take an agricultural industry out, okay, we don't do that anymore, it's not going to get exported or, you know, it's bad for the environment. How do we look after the country still and keep people there? You know, and then the whole carbon market was supposed to be a big thing, but what happened is corporations are buying up land and, you know, just planting it out and just leaving it and then trading carbon or leaving some sort of soil as well. And then you lose rural communities that are there to, who's going to fight the pests and weeds and, you know, it is a wicked problem, but I guess the world's facing that now too. I mean, we've been wearing it for a while, but now the world's heading in this place. I just wonder, how can we support people that are growing, you know, we need healthy food and we need those people to stay in the country to look after that environment as well. And I can't see it happening without some sort of sharing of the cost. I had a look in Europe. They have a thing called Good Agricultural Environmental Condition under the European Union. And they pay for stewardship, if you like. That's cultural and environmental stewardship. And I interviewed, also I went to a few different countries. I interviewed at the EU level, and I went to Wales as well and looked at from the government level right down to the farmer. No one had any hang-up about paying money towards that policy because they hadn't had a disconnection in culture, you know. Whereas in Australia, that's a subsidy, you know, we just go play by the market. You know? If you say you want to be recognised for delivering ecosystem service and have a payment, how is that different? So I realise there's a cut in the European culture anyway, where looking after country and cultural values in Europe is never lost. And now we've got to try and justify it. And I guess the thing is, all the new rules that are in place, I think, have potential, but can farmers in a very market-driven economy, or even land managers, any land manager, can they afford it? You know, because we don't share the costs of it.
A really brief observation that just connects in an interesting way is when the issue of climate change started to really, really rise, all of a sudden you found a lot of people going to the Sami, to indigenous knowledge. And I thought, isn't this interesting? And that in a moment of crisis and not understanding what to do, they turn to indigenous knowledge bases.
I wonder if I could ask a question of Ryan. I'm just going to move slightly from the same question because I actually think that what White Australia has done in this country has come to our people for solutions to the ongoing problem created by the world. I might just say it's around. But I'm with the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. Our community is the third largest landowner in the state, and yet we can't get activation on the ground. We can't get past the the regulations within the industry. Our communities are sitting there going, surely we could branch out I'm not sure that the question is in the right place, but I thought I would ask you if you had any ideas about how we as a people should begin to start to engage with industry. I'm not just going to go to mining, I can go to farming, I can go to agriculture, I can do any of it. But at the end of the day, mining may be an issue, may be an industry that our community might fulfil in. The new one is obviously renewable energy. So, have you had any thoughts about that in recent time?
Yeah, well, over the years I've had a lot to do with land councils.
Okay.
That might leave us land, manage the land the way we want it, you know? The government wants to come in and damage it, you know? Happy win.
And I've seen the clashes between the state and the locals and now the native title PBCs is coming, which is made with but I see the basic thing is trust. You know, there's no trust. There's no trust between the Aboriginal community and the private sector or whatever sector wants to come and do business or do engagement. There's no trust at all. There's no trust between locals and state. There's no trust. So I suppose it's a matter of being able to show some pathways, because people go out to you know, organisations and say, oh, we should do this housing development or we should do all sorts of stuff. But what I see is missing in that is what are the options? So you want to do an aged care facility, these are the options you have to look. This is the type of land you need to present. These are your options. If you don't have all the skills to run your own aged care, or maybe you joint venture with someone that is able to get those number of beds into the facility, and the financiers don't pretty big about putting money on Aboriginal titled lands. And I've been talking to international banks for years saying, get out of your head the way you fund things, because we as Aboriginal people are not going to sell our land so you can secure it. But there are ways that we could have lease arrangements where the land's still owned by the community, but the business operates for the next 50 years. Our people can come in and work in that business, learn that trade. So our financiers have to think differently about how that works, and that means bringing on government to think differently. So I see a trust and what are the options around that style of business, and I see those, and you know, until some of those things are looked at closely and resolved, I don't think we're really going to get anywhere. And
Gap's not closing.
yeah, that's what I see anyway.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Thank you for today's presentations. I said here, periodically struggling to get my head around what was being talked about, but it was fascinating, the breadth and the depth of what was presented today. Well, thank you for that, first of all. One of the words I heard today was creolising, and that was a new word to me, and I wanted to ask a question about that, and I also wanted to ask a question about the Imagination University. Because I want to be talking about a wānanga tomorrow that we have at home, which is our version, if you like, of that. But the creolising question I wanted to ask you, Tyson, was basically this: is what Shay talked about today an example of creolising linguistics? You can comment on that, and then Steph, you can comment on the Imagination University.
Well, it means not regarding these disciplines as separate things in a stack. And if we look at it in a stack, we see how they're connected and see what's at the foundation. Which is why I've asked the sister girl here to check out David Graeber and also Nicholas Evans, because he's a linguist, but he can't separate out psychology, particularly cognitive psychology, from linguistics, and that the magic is there. You know, where all psychology has been built on test subjects who were white and middle class, mostly male, especially cognition. Yeah, and the things in endangered languages like show us all different things, like how if you're Spanish or Turkish or Japanese, you don't see a ball rolling down a hill. You see a ball descending a hill, rolling, because of your language. You process the whole thing, and you see the whole thing different. You know? Everything. So you can't separate psychology and linguistics, and you can't separate, if you read Graeber, you can't separate politics, history, evolutionary psychology, and archaeology, and that narrative of human development, which has not changed despite the changes in discoveries and what archaeologists know to be true now. They have it in their papers, but nobody reads it. So when you see the news, when you see people in other disciplines like psychology, education, bloody anything you can name, they're still operating from a story that's wrong story. You know, and Graeber he puts some really good, he weaves it all together in a really good story, Dawn of Everything. He passed away last year, so unfortunately he's done. You know, where you can work your way through that stack. So that's what I suggest for creolization. It has to be conscious and it has to be done with an understanding of the narratives of the dominant cultures that we're coming up against. It has to be an understanding, because we have to have story. You know, them old people, you know, you say to them, oh, what can you do to stop these young fellas from drinking? And they'll be like, well, what's the story for alcohol? We've got to be able to classify that first and, you know, decide where it fits in the universe, you know. It's got to be categorized, it's got to have a totemic relation, somebody's got to own it. What's the frickin' story, you know? And so someone sits down and talks about the whole Bacchanalian Greek Dionysus thing. They might talk about Zulu beer making. They might talk about Viking beer making. And those like naked Viking women like fighting each other bare-breasted over the beer pots to put finger into them and all this kind of, there's freaking really good story, you know. We don't meet each other with the stories, with that proper stories, you know. But we need to like look at the Gammon stories, you know, which are basically, white people, like a real narrow idea of who white people are. They're a master race and they come from a long lost homeland somewhere, we haven't found it yet. We used to call it Aryan, you know, and then that became unpopular, so we pretended it was from the Caucasus Mountains in Russia, so we call them Caucasian for a while. That became unpopular also, so now we call them Indo-European. And where's Indo-European, that story everywhere. Linguistics, you've got a whole family of language trees that's bullshit based on this idea that somewhere there's a frickin' Atlantis where the white people came from, and they can find it. And that came down from Victorian bitches and bastards like, just witches like that frickin' Helena Blavatsky, who was like pretending to channel, you know, as a medium, all these spirits, you know, that were showing her, you know, and that's what launched the Age of Discovery. They didn't come here looking for tobacco plantations. They come down here looking for Atlantis. They were trying to find where they were from, so they could prove like with the dominance, that there's a story of dominance there. And it's still what they're looking for in every single discipline. So you've got to be able to identify the wrong story, and you have to be able to connect with the right story, the good stuff, you know? And that is all, that's where eliminationism, eugenics, you know, genocide, all comes out of that master race thing. If your kids go to a Steiner school, you don't know what holistic means. Where's that girl? Cited her before. You know, that's the same one. They reckon that, you know, you get reborn into a higher race each time You know, you get reborn every time when you reincarnate, but you keep, in your baby teeth, you keep the essence of your previous race, your darker race, and now you're getting lighter. Okay, so you're not allowed to learn how to read until you lose your last baby teeth in Stein, because that's that bad race coming out of you. That's all bullshit. It comes straight out of the same text. Wrong story, wrong story, wrong story, wrong story. You gotta find the right story. You know, so like how we deal with pests here, cane toad. You know, I'm yarning with people in Ecuador. You know, indigenous people in Ecuador, where that cane toad is. And they also have gum trees there. The colonists planted there to drain swamps. They got a right story, their culture for gum trees, and our elders can talk to them that way. They can tell us about those cane toads.
What do you mean?
You know, same way. We talk to Irish people, they got that law for foxes, and we're finding out how to actually make a good relation with those foxes and bring them into symbiotic balance. You know, it's important. You've got to find the right story with the people, and like know the wrong story and what's bullshit and what to avoid. That's all of it. Sorry, there's so much detail. Like I only picked like the small bits. There's a lot more.
As I was listening to Sharon, I was thinking, is this criminalising her?
Yeah.
What you were
Well, I mean, if we like hang out after, me and Adi,
Yeah.
me and Adi can sing the cane toad song for you. We did that ceremony.
And the Imagination University?
Oh, sorry, what was the?
Oh, we'll just have,
Creolization.
just only get that in my head. Is that
Yeah.
quite different from your typical university?
No, like connected, and I think like a good entry point to have a look at where it's applied is the OLAB methodology space, so how to
Just pick up that and tell it, it's a really good topic for you. I like it.
thank you.
Yeah.
So someone like Noel Butler, who's living down the country in Milton and holding ceremonial practices in relation to different species there that allow the governance of that land, because you're responding to the signals you're in there. And you know, a lot of this for me is very new, so I'm careful when I'm talking about it, and I'm helping to incubate a lot of the knowledges in these spaces. But the idea is the organisations on one sphere are looking for knowledge to be applied to help, I guess, wind back extractive economies. Because we rely on it. We've got everything around us, right? Electricity, like it's but it's not sustainable. Like we know that the economy that we have, like in growth, is not something that is going to be allowed simply because everything's out of balance. So transitioning that and I guess shifting the whole value system as well is part of the work that we have to do, and being in relation to do that, so that it's not just the humans that are determining the values. When we get knowledge, not running, changes the value, but who is identifying and signalling and agreeing on that value for their health as well. So we have that as one approach, but essentially the tools that we leave behind hopefully will be the things that help codify and what Tyson said, you know, the objects that hold the story in the museums are working in people's dreams. The space for imagination, like that's part of the challenge, is just to make space. Getting pinged from every direction, we don't have the time to connect, be in relation, to think about what nature's trying to tell us. So that's part of the challenge as well. So that's what we're kind of winding back and giving people time and space to do that as part of the patterns of how we connect. And then that's one also like a force multiplier effect for people that are doing economic work and land work and get together and something emerges as a solution. Mixed with mentoring and custodianship as the practices, and doing equity economics. Because why can't we trade in leaders if we're trading coins? Or donut economics, another, like
Yeah, so yes.
Thank you, thank you.
Are there any inter-panel questions?
Huh. Rod, I'm curious, I don't know if this would relate to your work, but I am curious whether it does have any connection. And the reason why why I'm uncertain is because it deals with nationhood. One of the criteria of nationhood, and Kara left, and maybe she's the person that it might apply to, but one of the things that characterizes a nation is the ability to engage in treaties with other nations. And there have been CERT, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. They started out of Oklahoma, and they had an impact, strong impact in the mid-1970s onward, and then they branched off into Canada and started having an international imprint and impact. And I have the ability to form treaties does some interesting things, because right now in the United States, one of the things that governs who is native, who is indigenous, who is Indian, is blood quantum. And the government decides if you're, and it's bizarre because it's based on just abstract math, but if your blood quantum drops below 25%, what that means is if you have a grandmother who's full blood, and then you keep marrying non-native people, then by the time you get to the grandchild, they're 25%. They marry somebody that's not native, then they're no longer native. But it gets more complicated than that, because when I was in college, I knew someone who was full-blooded native of 5 different tribes. And so by government identity, he was not native at all. But he was a full-blood Indian. So because of that, I'm chairing a doctoral student who's working with this organization called FANA, and I don't remember what the acronym stands for, other than Native Americans or something like that in there. But they are circumventing this whole idea of a government defining who is native by engaging in treaties with other nations outside of the United States, and they now have representation at the United Nations. And I don't know what you think about that as far as expanding your vision and where your vision sits, whether that has any application of engaging internationally, either through treaties or mini-treaties, however you want to label it, but that draws a different kind of power. When the Assembly of First Nations existed as one entity, one political entity, and this was something I talked about as a graduate student, a single entity across all of Canada that unified all Indigenous people, the government spent 6 years trying to fracture that up because they had a headache. And I kept saying, move across the border, create a single entity that would represent Indigenous peoples of North America, and the government could do nothing. So I don't know what your thoughts about that would be.
The problem that comes in international law, and international law that's taken on board the whole Westphalian.
But it's all European.
Whole Westphalian idea of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so we are fighting for our sovereignty to become first nations, not first peoples, which already are the first nations. Nation was a thing that was only invented like a century ago. And it was invented under that Westphalian model, so there's this idea of these sovereignties and these sovereigns, which are completely alien to us. It's completely alien and exclusionary border work practice that isolates, it creates enmity. It's about blocking, stopping flows of access across country, which includes flora and fauna and everything else, not just human beings. It gives an idea of other, of outsider, and people who must be eliminated, people who are contagion, people who are toxin, all these things.
That's only
So
if you think
people
that
who are
way.
pollution, and then there's all these ideas, that's where you get blood quantum, everything else. But then it goes the other way for, it's just one drop to be black, if someone wants to exterminate you. It's just one drop to be Jewish, if somebody wants to exterminate you. It's just whatever. So that whole Westphalian thing, it's about inalienable sovereignty, unless someone with bigger guns wants to take your shit, and then they can.
Tyson,
It's lie,
Tyson,
we're going the wrong way.
you're
Wrong
talking
story.
about Australia. I wasn't talking about Australia, I was talking about North America.
Yeah,
So-
it's everywhere, everywhere is Westphalian.
If you're talking about undermining a government that is suppressing you, the way you do that is get above and higher than the government that is suppressing you.
Yeah,
And that's what I'm talking about.
yeah, true. Creolize that shit from the top. But beware that wrong story while you're climbing up there. Because, finish up like, I don't know if people end up being chiefs from the English understanding what a chief is, and, you've seen where that happens too,
But there were sachems,
Yeah.
and people forget that there were sachems.
Mm.
And that comes from an indigenous perspective as well.
Yeah, true, right.
It's just a different word. Any other thoughts? This is what this is supposed to be about, a discussion.
I had a provocation. Like, I've got to check, if we think about creolization, I've got to challenge, that little bit of wisdom, there was an elder, I don't know, there was an elder who said, my land doesn't speak English. And everybody's like, whoa, mind blown. Wow, yeah, it's just Aboriginal language. But, like, there's a couple of centuries of our ancestors who've died, and where are they? Oh, they're in the land. So, is it not possible that the land does know English and does know our Creoles? I don't know, I just wanted to put that as a provocation, see what people thought about.
Well, one of the things that I said, I don't know if this is what you, I don't know if this is what you meant, but one of the things that I said was, I don't do land acknowledgements at home.
Yeah.
When I do something, I have somebody come in from that territory to speak to the land in the language of the land. I did say that.
Yeah.
Now, if you are indigenous to that land, then you speak to the land in that indigenous language. And I've said, if you're Irish, then you have a language of the land in Ireland. I had an article that was published here in Australia, in a book that Rhonda Craven had written, and somebody asked me, maybe that was out at Alice Springs, they asked me, how come you fellas, Indians, meaning Native Americans, don't align with American blacks? I said, well, that's a different history.
Yeah.
And I said, I am indigenous, but I can't come here to Australia and say, just because I'm indigenous, I have some stake in the land here, because that's not where my indigeneity lies. And so it's along those lines. So if you talk about, if you're buried in the land, do you now become the language of the land? Well, maybe if that's where your little mortgage house was, and you're buried underneath your house on the prairie, but that doesn't make you indigenous.
But five centuries of ancestors knowing English and then returning, to the land and that spirit of the land.
You mean in a country that isn't theirs?
No, of your ancestors.
Yeah?
Yeah, so your own, so Arapaho ancestors learning English, knowing English and other languages and returning to the land. Does that mean the land knows those languages? Just as a little translation or something?
Well, that's interesting, because I was in ceremony, Sundance, and one of our respected elders, who's no longer there, he started talking about that in an Arapaho, that old man, and he was talking about a ceremonial item, and he said in language that old man is getting faint, and what that meant was he was getting weak because he wasn't being fed. and the question was, what was not feeding that old man? And it was language.
Mm.
And so in ceremony, if you don't have the language, those items don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So I don't know as far as the land, but I would relate the land similar to that and what happened in ceremony. And
But
that's
you taught dolphins Arapaho.
what?
You taught dolphins Arapaho, so saltwater entities.
No, I didn't.
Saltwater people, you taught them Arapaho, which is freshwater, and you taught them, and they know it now, they swim around the ocean with Arapaho there.
I didn't actually teach
So if that
Arapaho.
happened,
I wanted to find out if they understood, if I could get them to understand Arapaho.
yeah.
I have a question. I have a qualifying question. If I come up with the idea to put that there, is language involved in that? I don't know.
Depends.
Yeah.
It depends on what's in your head when you decide to, and what most people will sub-voice. You will sub-voice an action before you actually do the action.
I'm not, okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll look out for stuff.
So the only time you're not sub-voicing is if I'm walking near your table and I go, boom, and it falls over. Because I didn't think to do that act. But if you want to put that model from that position to that position, there's a possibility you articulated that in your head first.
So like a scratch of the head or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before the
Yeah.
fact, not after.
Yeah.
Okay, just I'm gonna look out for it.
But it's shitty in English, because there's only 2 words here and there. But in indigenous languages, like there's 20 different ways to say 20 different ways to say there, depending on how far away it is, if it's moving or if it's still. Who's putting it there? Are they putting it there like in a stupid way so it's going to roll around and spill? Yeah.
Well, that's true.
So we've got nuance, and you think different.
You're
You think
right.
Different.
Because in Arapaho, if I'm moving somewhere, the language has to express embedded in it, whether that's by foot, whether that's by car, whether that's by airplane, whether that's by train, and none of those words as nouns are actually embedded in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's what's in the Bible, there's like an English word border, and then there's indigenous words which are like so many naming words for it. And that helps you read
All right, I don't know if we have,
I might.
yeah?
Critical minerals. I've been watching this story a long time because I've got a mining industry background. Now, they had a Four Corners report on critical minerals, and telling the story. But the only part they covered in that was the green issue on critical minerals. Saying that, the Greens are going to have difficulty because they're anti-mining, but pro, renewables. So, and that's how they got. They did not even address the indigenous part of the story, where are most of these critical minerals located? On our land. Now, when governments start listing things as of national importance, it's usually an undercover story of saying, this is of national importance. That means we can tone down the environmental standards. That means because it's important to the country, we can tone down the indigenous interests. And that's really a code for being able to tone down all those things to be able to go in and get the mining done. So that's something we've got to keep in the back of our minds, that really that's just code for limiting those standards. So that we see that this is important, because it's important to the Americans and the rest of the world that we mine the shit out of it and give it away.
And when you look at who's financially benefiting from it, so say in the case of Dogo, the royalties go to the government. The companies are always dressed up as Australian companies, but they're actually other other money from elsewhere. And then what's left of the mining legacy is the community is left to clean it up because they go belly up. And I'm not anti-mining, there's a place for mining to occur, but what's happened at the moment is exploration licenses is open slather. There's nothing, there's nowhere that you can say, no, we're not going to allow you to have an exploration license.
But like I said, it's code for let's get it
fast track.
fast track and sidestepping environmental and sidestepping Indigenous rights. That's really what this national interest is code.
And what I'm sort of saying, what's flagged for Gulbenkian country, it's happening across Australia, mainly because of the geopolitical circumstances, not actually scarcity of need at this point. It's more the geopolitical, okay, it's China, you know, and Russia and America and Australia, you know, we've got to sort of position ourselves as future warfare, basically, is the other story.
And build more Teslas.
I guess, you know, I've seen what effect it has on the community though. When you take on a mining company, it's just exhausting. And then they can just, oh, okay, the market's dropped, we'll just go to sleep. But they still have the exploration licence on there, and they shouldn't because the government's not supposed to let them hold it if they've done no drilling or anything. And then when the market picks up, they're back in there trying to sell it off to a mining development company as well. So it's a lot of stress that why should, like the government needs to work out, and it's the same with agriculture, there's some agriculture that shouldn't be occurring, it's inappropriate land use. You know, not open slather and then cause a problem, you know, and then who's going to clean it up later?
That whole thing is John Nash, staying power. And John Nash was I think he was a mathematician at MIT, and he wanted to know if you were playing a game with God, what does God have and what do you have and how long can you stay in the game? And one of those things, huh? Well, that's what they based it on, yeah. And so that was one of his things as a doctoral student, I believe. And staying power is one of the things, and that's what many companies and even military and police forces work off of. A lot of the work that John Nash talked about, and staying power is one of it. Corporations have staying power. It doesn't matter whether the individuals leave, the corporation has it. And that goes way back to superorganic. Alfred Kroeber, who wrote about the superorganic, which is an organism in and of itself, and it has staying power beyond the individual components of it.
Yeah. And I guess the other frame too is you don't want to be seen, you don't want to put that energy into fighting something all the time. Do you know what I mean? And I think Clark picked that up on, you know, what do we put our energy into? So before we were focusing on love, not loss, like try to connect people, what do you love about the plateau? You know, rather than focus on the loss, but how do we engage with people? Because a lot of people don't want to get into the polarity of those sorts of debates, I suppose. So it's how do you engage from that love, not loss, as well as not lose yourself in that distraction for investing your time and your time into positive things.
You mentioned not wanting to take on like mining companies. I think your response to Workshop when you were saying that even places that were recognised as like national parks, they could go underneath it. And we have some stuff coming from like a curriculum base or governments that recognise or they say that they recognise the importance of land and country, but how deep is that considered to be valued? Like, how can we, I guess, use cultural stewardship to push that it's not just what's on top. If you are recognising it at this level, you need to recognise it all the way down, and I guess all the way up and side to side. It's the waterways, the airs, and everything. Yeah, I guess it's something that we right to recognise. How can we push that leverage? So not to fight mining companies, but to make it they can't have that fight at all.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's really, to me, it's a government issue in how they're administrating that. And even with the mining, I think it's 6 inches, I think, you
Yeah.
only actually have ownership over.
Yeah, there's surface rights and subsurface rights, and
Yeah,
surface rights
yeah,
are
so-
most places
So
about half
then
a
it's
foot.
just mining, it's open slabber. And, but, I mean, there are some good news stories because there has been some precedents in this state where mining has been banned and passed through legislation, which we didn't have before. So we've got that as a, well, you said in the Hunter, because, you know, the equine industry and water quality was a big issue, you could change that. They banned offshore drilling and mining because of the environmental value of the ocean. So that's the New South Wales government. So there's some good precedences there that we're gonna try and test that out. But it's just interesting. You go, oh my God, this mining company's so big. Like they're big. They reckon they've come and engaged with the community. I haven't seen them yet. And so we're just going to go down that path of, well, here are all the environmental and cultural values, and here's all your commitment to international law and law, like, you know, just here's a precedence. We're going to try that rather than trying to push against the mining company, and to recognise that there's places that do need to be out of bounds for mining because they're just inappropriate on an environmental and cultural level. If there was antimony under the Opera House, what would happen? Would they just go, oh, Opera House, off you go, we're just going to put a big mine there?
They'd say they can't do it because it's a cultural significance.
It wasn't. But I mean, you know, this is just one of many conflicts that are going on around the world, I think. This critical mineral thing is happening everywhere, and you're right, it's Indigenous lands that a lot of that, not just in Australia but elsewhere, we are subject to that.
All right,
Yep.
I'm going to pull the plug on this, but it does show that this was worth having every up front with this discussion, this discourse, which is something that was always supposed to be a part of this, and it was supposed to happen each day, actually, but it's never happened. This is the first that it's happened, and I will try to see it happening in the future. I would encourage people to, we have a mixer at 5:30, and if you have questions you want to ask other speakers, seek them out. That's part of the mixer, and then corner them and ask them the questions during that period if you didn't get a chance. That's what the mixer's all about, so we'll see you at 5:30.
Hey there, wait